I am I'm humbled. I am honored and not only overjoyed, but I would have absolutely loved to be with you today. Um, so thank you everybody. I'm seeing the number of people coming in increasing and increasing quite fastly. So it just warms my heart to see that many people, because you do have many options, and you chose to be here. So it just gives me a great pleasure, and it really does warm my heart. Thank you for the Center for Language Education Research. Thank you, Leeds University. Thank you, especially my brother Harry and my girl Maggie. Very unfortunately, she cannot be with us. If you ever have done any of these sessions, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that it takes so much time and energy, not only to put things together, but to communicate with people and so on and so forth. So as a hip hop scholar, as a hip hopper through and through, we in hip hop we don't clap when you love something and when you wanna give it a prop up. What you do is you snap your fingers. So I'm gonna ask everybody, at least those of you who are in the camera, to snap your fingers to the center, to Maggie and the work that she's been doing. Um, and since this is Zoom, I'm gonna ask you once in a while to do this, because if we were physically present, I would have asked you to go in a typical African tradition of griot. So it's a CLER response. But once in a while, I'm gonna ask you to snap your fingers. I titled my talk, "What exactly is race got to do with a nice place like Leeds? Intersection or intersecting race, identity, and the pleasure of second language learning." Um, Clearly, as we all do, and I can't thank you again enough for doing that, but as we all do, we need some guidance, we need some agenda. Uh, I set up 3 things that I would love to share with you and discuss today. So given the original idea of the distinguished scholar in residence, which was titled Counter Narratives in Language Education Research, which was jinxed by COVID-19 because I was supposed to be with you, I want to focus on the link between race and language. And that's the missing link in so many different ways. Indeed, my first agenda for today is to argue that race, namely Blackness, works like a language. In fact, I will conclude that race is language. Situating my argument primarily within social linguistics, to argue that race works like a language is to argue that Blackness speaks, it minoritizes, and in a place like Leeds, it controls. This argument is particularly significant in a post-George Floyd moment. I know the UK may be different in some shape or form, but how radically different is it? In a post-George Floyd moment, I'm arguing we came to realize that language also mythologizes. It creates monsters who are in need to be controlled. Because if you don't control the monster, the argument goes, then you are calling for chaos. The second agenda for today is to fully grasp this idea that race works like a language. We need to expand the very notion of language itself and move it away from a strict classic Saussurean notion of language and bring it closer to semiotics or semiology, where the Black body, this body, speaks and speaks with its own phonetic and syntactic system. Then the last part of my talk is to bring in my own work around the rhizome of Blackness.
Oh, how they fear you. Oh, how your power strikes a nerve. Unsettled by their ancestors' demons. The injustice we face, what's the reason? The mandem on the ends are not to be feared but admired. Their demeanor stands strong, though I know that they're tired. Outside the corner shop is where most reside, with their Nike pouches, white Air Forces, and on their pedal bikes. School was never something they resonated with, because there are certain things the teachers don't teach the kids, like how life is hard, but for them it will be harder, because mommy lives in a council flat and daddy's skin's darker, because they weren't born with silver spoons in their mouths, because once you're in the game it's hard to get out, because white privilege isn't something they can experience, and through time and growth they'll start to see the differences. My patience may be wearing thin, but my skin is thick, my reality is rich, and I'm not referring to the pounds in my purse, I'm referring to my worth. Sex, drugs, and money barricaded in these illusions, drowning out all the confusion, trying to fuck up these institutions. We wear our scars like we're screaming a battle cry. We ready our weapons at the sound of a siren. Alien, transcendent, unknown. You must step into these territories in order to grow. There is no map, you cannot plan. Run towards the land, seize freedom in your hands. Never again will we allow such an injustice. I will not stand in the way of my destined path. I will not be stopped until I am rich from this earth. I am in control of the future that I deserve, and I don't look to society to affirm my worth.
We have just witnessed what my whole presentation is about, and that is race work like a language. Stuart Hall once wrote that race works like a language, and signifiers gain their meaning not because of what they contain in their essence, but in the shifting relations of difference which they establish with other concepts and ideas in a signifying field. Their meaning, because it's relational and not essential, can never be fully or transhistorically fixed. That is, there is always something about race left unsaid. In the Saussurean linguistic tradition, to argue that race works like a language is to presuppose that race has a syntactic structure, has a grammar, morphology, phonology, message receiver, and speaker. And although Stuart Hall, in his quote, is interested in the excess of race, that means that which is left unsaid, that which is left over. I, on the other hand, am interested in race as language, specifically on the phonology of race, how we speak it, what we say through our bodies, and what our bodies say to others. Clearly, we do not have control over what our Black bodies say. They are open to different, they are open for different readings, translation, and interpretation. As such, we speak race as much as it speaks us. Can I get a witness now? When I say that, I'm gonna ask you to snap your fingers once in a while to make sure that you're following with me. So succinctly, what does it mean to argue that race, namely Blackness, works like a language? It means 8 things, and that's what I will be talking about today. 1, Blackness is an empty signifier. Blackness has no inherent meaning. This is because objects do not mean, people put meaning onto them. In this sense, Blackness is whatever we think it is. If this is the case, then Blackness is a symbolic capital whose meaning and value can only be determined within a particular market, within a signifying economy of exchange. If we take the UK, the US, or Canada as symbolic markets of linguistic exchange, then Blackness is the marked signifier, while whiteness is unmarked, the transcendent, and the universal subject. In this sense, whiteness becomes signifying subject, while Blackness becomes signified other. 2, if we argue that race works like a language, then Blackness is not a possession. It is not something we have. It is relational. That is to say, Blackness is meaningful only in relation to other racial categories, whiteness, brownness, and so on and so forth, and in relation to other identity categories, such as gender, class, sexuality, ability, and so on and so forth. 3, to argue that race works like a language is to argue that Blackness is a discursive category. In other words, it's a social script. It is an unofficial but firmly expected role we play. It's a plot, a representational language that is beyond our individual control. And since, as Monique Wittig has argued, quote, there is no nature in society, end quote, Blackness is a historical, political, and social product. In this sense, Blackness is a performative category, a language we speak every day in how we dress, how we walk, how we talk. We perform it in our hair, in our makeup, and so on. Put otherwise, Blackness transcends the individual. It is a norm. It is a language we enter into, as it were, at birth. And through repetition, recitation, identification, marking, and everyday compulsory and normative acts, one, and that's ultimately what I'm arguing, becomes Black. To argue that Blackness, race works like a language is to argue that if this is the case, in other words, if race works like a language, if Blackness particularly works like a language, and if you accept my argument that race does work like a language, then one is not born Black. One becomes Black. We are born, period. But because we are born into a society, a language, we embody that language as our own. It becomes our mother tongue. This is how we become Black. We become Black by speaking Blackness as the mother tongue. A Black person is a Black person because she speaks from birth. She speaks Blackness from birth. Here, language forms as much as it performs identities. That is, we represent ourselves and identities in and through language. But as we are doing that, we also form those identities as we perform them. Language has the double task then of representing and expressing identities on the one hand, and forming and performing identities on the other. 5, to argue that race works like a language, however, we do not just perform our identities, our Blackness, as we wish, because it is historically and socially produced category, Blackness is not a totally free signifier, free floating signifier. Power intervenes to close the meaning of the object, as Michel Foucault has argued. So Blackness becomes a closed canvas and an already signified signifier. When power intervenes and closes the meaning of Blackness, 3 things happen. And I really, really want to note those 3 things. 1, Blackness finds itself sealed into objecthood, where its meaning is closed and its multi-ethnic, multinational, multicultural, and multilingual nature is negated. I don't know if you know that in the UK, there are at least 70 languages spoken by 120 languages spoken by Black people and who come from 70 countries. So Blackness is no longer a free-floating signifier or a multiple and contested side of Blackness. It becomes instead a one whose meaning is, and is already known. So the second thing that happens when power intervenes and closes the meaning of language, of Blackness, is that Blackness is defined and hence treated as a lack, as a negative, as an other, that which is not white, the transcendent. The ironic thing after George Floyd murder, and it seems to the UK is waking up also with the interview with Megan last week, that white people all of a sudden they realize that's how they think, and that's how they think about Blackness. They close its meaning, and so my thinking here, and this is just something provocative for the discussion, is that white people discover that I'm arguing that the only way out of this way of thinking, I would suggest, is for white people to take their ignorance seriously. 3, when power intervenes and closes the meaning of Blackness, then this body before you right now is no longer representing only itself, but it becomes responsible for a whole race and ancestors. Can I get a witness now? Are you with me? Now, 6, to argue that race works like a language is to expand the meaning of the very category that we're dealing with, that is language. We need to take it away from, we need to take it away from, let me just, from the Saussurean approach and bring it closer to semiotics. Within semiotics or semiology, the least of what people say and speak is through the verbal utterance. Language is more than what people say. That is, most, in fact, of what we communicate is nonverbal, through our bodies, through our clothes, through our hair, through our makeups, and so on. Ronald Barthes called these signifiers, which in turn constitute texts, as he calls them, that are open for different interpretation dependent on the context, the message, the sender, and the receiver. In a semiotic sense, language does not work in mimesis. That is to say, like a mirror, where the faithful correspondence is one-to-one between language and the so-called real world. Here, language does not work by simply reflecting or imitating the truth that is already out there and fixed in the real world. This is because meaning does not lie in the object, in the person, in the event. Things do not mean, Stuart Hall argues. We construct meaning using representational systems. If this is so, where then does lie the meaning? I want to contend that meaning is produced at the borderline between two interdependent yet dialectic entities, the language system on the one hand, or any other representational system, and the social actors, those who actually create, use, and make meaning of that system. 7, To argue that race works like a language from a semiotic point of view, from a social linguistics point of view, is to argue that this is, for me at least, this is how race should be, or Blackness in particular, should be approached and understood. Let me take George Floyd's murder as an example and link it to our discussion on language. George Floyd was killed, I want to argue, precisely because white social actors, the eyes and the writers of power in North America, closed the meaning of Blackness. Blackness is no longer an empty signifier, open for different interpretations. Blackness is a closed one, and it's closed mostly in nihilistic and negative sense. Blackness now is a narrative, a mythology, a monster in need of control. Just compare the reaction of the police and the FBI in relation to Black Lives Matter versus the January 6th insurrection in the US Capitol. A Black person no longer represents only himself or herself. She represents a whole racial group. A Black person is now a mythologized narrative, mostly negatively. Once you create a mythologized narrative around that person, their bodies are part of that mythologizing. In this sense, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, this mythologized narrative has created an out of control menace, a semiotics of a violent body that needs to be imprisoned or otherwise taken out of society by murdering it. Just watch the video of the murder of George Floyd, and you will see a faceless, physically menacing body of a Black person who needs to be controlled. Trigger warning. The following pictures are extremely painful to watch. If it is not controlled, I want to argue, that is the Black body, you will never be sure what it would do. This is what I'm calling the mythologized, the semiotic narrative of the monster. Here it is worth noting that the Black body points to la présence africaine, that is the African presence in the West, the history of the Middle Passage, slavery, a history that a lot of people would prefer not to deal with or at least put under the rug. The UK is no exception here. And I need to pause. The UK is no exception here. How much of the UK's violent murder, colonial enslavement history is being taught or talked about in the UK right now? I'm just saying. Can I get a witness now? I'm glad you're following me. Finally, to summarize, if meaning does not lie in the object, Blackness then is an empty signifier, unless it is perceived, acknowledged, and situated within a historical, social, political, symbolic, and a signifying system. This system is performed in the grammar of the everyday, and its meaning, that is the meaning of Blackness, is both unconsciously internalized and fixed through an exercise of power. Out of this grammar of the everyday, Blackness is stripped of any market value. This is precisely the reason why my emphasis in my own work is not on race per se, but on racialization, that is the process of becoming Black. It's on racism. And here I have been arguing that we have racism without race, since race does not exist in scientific sense. In fact, according to my own research, only within this signifying economy can Blackness gain any value. And given its performative nature, this value is ever changing. In sum, read as language, Blackness then is a complex syntactic, morphological, phonological, and semantic system that is forever dual, that is conscious and unconscious, forming and performing, constructing and representing. Can I get a witness now? Are you with me? Nice. Because now the real thing comes in. As we all do, I'm just saying, those are the two books that will change your life. So get them, okay? You need to get those books. I'm kidding. No, seriously, you got to get those two books, okay? I'm just kidding. So here's where I want to bring all of this discussion back to us, language teachers and language researchers. In North America, and this is where I want to situate my work and then bring it back to some of the work that a lot of you have been doing. In North America, I have argued that at least over the last 15 to 20 years, Blackness is an all-encompassing figure. It is a colossal umbrella. So when the population that I have been researching, who are Black immigrants, mostly continental Africans, and you have quite a number of them in the UK, when they came to North America, namely to Canada and the US, they were subsumed under this umbrella of Blackness. In other words, they fall under the narrative of Blackness. However, when they first arrived, they have not a freaking clue what Blackness is. What does it actually mean to be a Black person in North America? They didn't have any clue. So they enter the process of, and this is very, very significant, becoming Black. And this is what I have been documenting. From an ethnographic, from bottom up, and from an everyday practice, what does it actually mean to become, namely to become Black? They start by understanding the narrative and the mythology that was created around Blackness. So that's the first thing they do. They translate, they make sense of the surrounding. Particularly, they make sense of Blackness around them. So psychically, they find themselves caught between their cultural and linguistic background on the one hand, and their encounter with Blackness on the other. They end up creating what I'm calling, to use Homi Bhabha's idea, a third space that doesn't fully belong to the Americas, nor fully to the continent of Africa, but the two combined. This psychic process of identity formation ends up creating what I'm calling the rhizome of Blackness. And let me just take a couple of seconds to explain what I mean by that. So in botany, those of you who know the term, there's the plant, okay? So there's the tree, the tree, the top of the tree is here, and then there are the roots at the bottom. And in botany, the rhizome are the roots that are under the surface, the things that we cannot see. But the whole tree is dependent on the rhizome, is dependent on the roots. So what you see is the bottom, is the top, which is the surface of this skin that you see before you. But there's the series of roots that are under that we cannot see. The rhizome doesn't flow like this, like my hand right now. The rhizome flows like this in all directions. It flows in different shapes, different forms. However, it all receives the sun's, the rain, everything else from the top. So I'm interested in the different ways in which Blackness emerges. So when you have Black immigrants coming to North America, what they do is they create a rhizomatic category of Blackness. In other words, they complicate the very category that we're dealing with. And that's what I'm interested in, is in the diversity and the rhizomatic nature of Blackness. The rhizome are the roots of the tree which we cannot see. Black immigrants might look Black in front of the mythology and the law of Blackness, but their Blackness is more complicated than what you see on the surface. So in the case of Black immigrants, the rhizome of Blackness calls for a more complex, complicated, multidimensional, multicultural, multilingual, and multinational category of Blackness. And I just gave you the example of the UK, same thing in North America. The rhizome of Blackness disrupts the unidimensional and the mythologized notion of Blackness. Blackness has always been multiple. Just to be very specific, I'm going to share with you 6 conclusions that I reached from my own work. One, there are no Black people in Africa. In fact, in the continent, we are Wolof speakers, we are Cameroonais, we are Zulu, and we are Dinka. However, once we come to North America, all of these adjectives, all of the descriptors are subsumed under the umbrella of Blackness. You are seen as Black, therefore you are Black. Conclusion 2. But Black immigrants have no idea or had no idea of this what Blackness is. They have no solid comprehension. And here I have to be very clear. They have no solid comprehension of the grammar of Blackness, the grammar of the everyday of Blackness, and how to speak it. So when they arrive to North America, they enter the process of becoming Black. That is, they translate and make sense of what it means to be Black while negotiating their sense of self. In doing so, they complicate the very category of Blackness, making it rhizomatic. 3, becoming Black means learning not the standard ESL, but BESL, that is Black English as a second language. But they are learning BESL precisely because they are becoming Black. So we enter a vicious cycle. When do we learn and when do we become? 4, here identity is directly implicated in what we learn. That's in essence, I'm talking to a big conclusion here for all of us as language teachers. Identity is implicated in what we learn, how we learn it, and why we learn it. In the case of Black immigrants, they are learning Black English as a second language, which they access in and through hip hop and other Black popular cultural forms, precisely because this is where they see themselves mirrored. This is where they see themselves represented. That is, when you're locked out of the public space, where you cannot see yourself reflected anywhere, you would look for spaces where you see yourself represented and mirrored. In the case of Black immigrants, it is in Blackness, in hip hop identity, in Black pop culture in general, where they invest their identities, their desires, hence the journey of becoming Black and learning Black English as a second language. 5, when it comes to curriculum, and this is a central point to those who are interested in the curriculum aspect of language, Black popular culture and hip hop in particular, those emerge as a curriculum site. Elliot Eisner proposed three types of curriculum: what he calls the explicit, that which is expected and mandated by the state and students are tested on. Then there is the implicit curriculum, which is that which is expected, but the students are not tested on. And there, the third one is the null, N-U-L-L, the null curriculum, which he defines as that which is related to students' lives, but not taught at school. This is where hip hop and Black popular culture in general become a null site. It is directly related to my research participants' lives, but not taught at schools. 6, immigrants are not refugees. A resident of Hong Kong who decides to move to Leeds with more than $250,000 is an immigrant, while an Eritrean who comes ashore to the Italian island of Lampedusa with an unmarked boat is a refugee. She did not leave home. She had to flee home.
Home. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. And the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factories, holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. And even then, you carry the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in airport toilets, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you would not be going back. You have to understand, and no one would put their children in a boat unless the sea is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the gallbladder of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than journey. No one crawls under fences, wants to be beaten, wants to be pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison because prison is safer than a city of fire, and one prison guard in the night is safer than 14 men who look like your father. No one could take it, could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. The go home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry. Niggas with their hands out, they smell strange, savage, messed up their own country, and now they want to mess up ours. How do the words, dirty looks, roll off your back? And maybe it's because the blow is softer than a limb torn off, or the words are more tender than 14 men between your legs, or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child's body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of a gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs. Leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hungry, beg, forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home unless home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here.
My original question, what exactly is race got to do with a nice place like Leeds? I want to argue everything. And that's my proposal on the table.
I'd like to thank Awad and everyone who joined us today. So Awad, thank you so much again for such an excellent inspiring, eye-opening talk, which triggered this discussion. And I think we will continue talking about some of the issues that you have raised. And it is important, like Harry mentioned, it is important to think about how we, researchers, educators, academics, can initiate a change. Yeah, what can we do to change something, not only in academia and in education, but also in the society in general. And I'm sure we will continue having these discussions, which will eventually lead to something meaningful.
No, thank you. Thank you again, Tag. Thank you, Maggie, Martin, Harry, the center and Leeds University. I'm humbled, exceptionally, profoundly thankful for every minute, and I can't thank you enough. It's from my end, my only hope is if I planted some seeds, let it be. If I failed, I hope we will continue the conversation, and in the conversation, we will enlighten each other. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
Okay. Bye.